This is Police Week, in colloquial terms, Law Enforcement Week. And traditionally, we do two things in Law Enforcement Week. One, we recognize the valor and the sacrifice and the commitment of the police officers who serve our communities, who serve us in Congress, and who serve across the country. And two, we try to think of ways that we actually can assist them in doing their jobs better, so we can make their work more effective and safer, and we can make the police function generally more efficacious for the American people. And unfortunately, with this bill, we're not doing either. And in fact, the majority is really falling down on the job in terms of both of those major objectives. In 2022, on March 15th, we passed H.R. 2471 to post in the Capitol, on the west side of the Capitol, a plaque in honor of the hundreds of police officers who nobly served us on January 6, 2021, when our institution, when our democracy came under attack by Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and other violent extremists who stormed the Capitol, drove members of the House of Representatives out of our chamber, drove members of the Senate out of their chamber, and attempted to overthrow a presidential election. Now, the new administration has seen fit to pardon more than 1,500 rioters and violent insurrectionists who attempted to overthrow our constitutional form of government on that day. And they succeeded in bloodying, wounding, injuring, hospitalizing more than 140 police officers on January the 6th. And several officers died in the subsequent weeks, and several people died on that day. Now, we passed a law, not a recommendation, not an idle promise, not a suggestion in a suggestion box. We passed a law to post this plaque in the U.S. Capitol. And yet Speaker Johnson has done absolutely nothing to post this plaque. And I know that some of my colleagues think that they are being most effective when they're doing nothing. This is a Congress that's getting the reputation for being perhaps the greatest do-nothing Congress in the history of the United States. But here's one thing that this Congress can do, which is to post this plaque, which reads, "On behalf of a grateful Congress, this plaque honors the extraordinary individuals who bravely protected and defended this symbol of democracy on January 6, 2021. Their heroism will never be forgotten." What an extraordinary irony that is. Their heroism is already being forgotten, or at least there's some people who would like us to forget their heroism. Well, that's on the symbolic front, because everybody wants to pay lip service to the police. Everybody wants to say we honor them. Well, let's really honor them. Let's put up a permanent plaque for future generations of Americans to see that these officers risked their lives for the people in this chamber, for the members of the House and the Senate, for the leadership of the House and the Senate, for the staff who work here, for the reporters who are here. We have many officers who have had to leave the police service because they've been wounded and disfigured permanently by the injuries they suffered at the hands of these people. This is the very least we can do at a time when the President of the United States is saying he wants to create a fund for January 6th. Not a fund for Michael Fanone, who had a heart attack and had to beg for his life. Not a fund for Sergeant Gunnell, who was forced out of the force because of permanent injuries and now is living on a fraction of the salary he had before, trying to support his family. Not a fund for Officer Hodges, who was tortured in the eyes of the world, who got caught in the doorway while the insurrectionists beat him with all of their weapons that they brought that day. No, it's not a fund for them that President Trump is suggesting. He wants a fund for the rioters. He wants a fund for the families of the insurrectionists. And as Sergeant Gunnell said recently, it seems like he believes that the rioters and insurrectionists were the ones defending the Capitol on that day. Let's get this plaque up. We voted for it on an overwhelming bipartisan basis, and I appeal to Speaker Johnson to enforce the law. Even if you don't like it anymore, even if you change your mind about the plaque, this is the law. Let's get it up there. Now, secondly, we should be talking about how we can actually aid and abet and assist law enforcement officers in their work. And unfortunately, we have not had from the majority a single bill that they're willing to bring to the floor to increase any funding for local law enforcement. On the contrary, the emissaries from DOJ, and here I don't necessarily hold my colleagues accountable for this because they didn't seem to know about it any more than we did, but the functionaries of DOJ slashed more than $500 million that the Department of Justice was giving to local police departments across the country and community safety groups and organizations assisting victims of rape and sexual assault. And as far as we can tell, one person in DOJ, one unelected midnight bureaucrat whose career was made with Elon Musk, who seems to have skipped town now, that guy cut out hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to local law enforcement and community safety groups across America. And I introduced an amendment in the budget reconciliation process in the Judiciary Committee to restore all of that money. Not a single member, neither a Democrat nor a Republican, spoke against it. And my Republican colleagues did not say a word, but they all voted against it. They voted to uphold that nasty handiwork of DOJ, slashing hundreds of millions of dollars, which we appropriated on a bipartisan basis in the House, in the Senate, signed by the President, programmed by the Department of Justice, and awarded to their communities. My community, your communities, communities across the country, and one young person, a midnight computer hacker from DOJ, Elon Musk's emissary, destroyed all of it, more than 300 grants. And now they come forward with a budget for next year that would cut more than $1 billion out of law enforcement. FBI, Department of Justice, ATF, you name it. Our colleagues have different reasons that they advance for this, which I think are pretty refutable. But in the big picture, this bill does nothing for existing police officers right now. It does nothing to enhance public safety. And our friends have completely missed the mark, I think, in terms of what Law Enforcement Week should be all about. I'll reserve.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, a law enforcement officer does not cease being a law enforcement officer merely because he's off duty or because of where he goes or she goes. And upon retirement, the scars of service, including the animosities built up with many people who do not care for law enforcement officers because they have been subject to the enforcement of the law over the course of a career. Upon retirement, those old animosities often linger. So those of us who support this measure and support it strongly understand and argue that it is essential to the safety of our existing officers and to the safety of our retired officers that we recognize that ongoing risk and burden that they have taken on and that they continue to carry, and allow them to continue to carry the means to defend themselves and others in reasonable locations, as in many states, ordinary civilian concealed carry permit holders may do. So we think it's common sense legislation. And I would just point out in response to some of the comments of my colleague from Maryland, I wasn't here in 2004 during the debates that he cited over the original LEOSA. I have no reason to doubt the accuracy of what he said. But I would say this, it is now 20 years later, and I think that history has shown us that many of the concerns presented in 2004 were not in fact realized by LEOSA's enactment, nor will they be realized as a result of enactment of this strengthening of that underlying statute for our officers. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman reserved, the gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my distinguished colleague's suggestion that I may have the wisdom of somebody who's been here for 21 years, but actually I wasn't here either then. I got it just from the books myself. I was here, I should say, in 2021 when the chamber was stormed, and that is a day I'll never forget. So forgive my passion on the point of getting that plaque up. I wish our colleagues would just help us convince the Speaker of the House this is something that's simple and it should be done. And it's not a partisan issue. On that day, we were not Democrats or Republicans. We were Americans, and we were legislators together being hounded and chased out of this chamber by people who did not accept the constitutional rules of the game. And to me, it's a matter of great regret and melancholy that somehow it's become politicized to the point where people can't even acknowledge what they were saying at the time. We had Republican leaders who were describing it as terrorism and saying it was absolutely inexcusable and indefensible. And now, all of a sudden, we have the majority which will not even follow the law by posting a plaque in honor of the officers who gave blood and sweat and tears on that day. One of them, Officer Hodges, who got caught in the doorway, and the whole world saw him screaming to high heaven for probably, I don't know if it was 45 seconds or maybe it was up to 90 seconds as he was being beaten and pummeled and he was being crushed in the doorway. And when they finally dislodged him, they took him back where they were taking the officers. And you know, we were very shorthanded. And they wanted to tell him to just stay there and wash his eyes out. Well, he took about 5 to 10 minutes. They were pouring water in his eyes, and he got up, and you know what he did? He went back outside and he rejoined the battle because he said he knew that they needed him, and we were outmanned and we were outflanked by the forces of violence that came down on us on that day. That's the kind of bravery that we should be at least acknowledging, if not praising. I know at the time we thanked them for saving our lives, and people did die that day. And again, there were more than 140 officers who were wounded and brutalized and injured, and many still have the physical injuries and scars that they're dealing with, as well as the mental scars, because there's a lot of post-traumatic stress syndrome. One of, or several of the officers who were there had been in the Iraq War, and they'd been in the Afghan War, and they testified before the January 6th Select Committee that several of them testified they had never seen violence as brutal and as bloody as what took place on January 6, 2021, with the various extremist groups that came and led the attack on the chamber and then gave bloody instructions to the rest of the mob about how to treat police officers in their effort to go and hang Mike Pence. That was the chant I can still hear in my mind ringing off of the walls of the Capitol. Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence. And where's Nancy? Where's Nancy? So we're not going to allow this to be buried into some kind of Orwellian memory hole. We've got a law requiring that that plaque go up, and we're going to see that that plaque goes up and that the law is enforced. You know, as for the LEOSA reform, again, it doesn't even purport to do anything for police and law enforcement today. It would increase I suppose, increase some of the mobility of retired officers, off-duty officers to go to places like restaurants and bars and public parks and national parks and metros and buses and so on with their police. I think that that should be decided by our communities, whether people are doing concealed carry there. I thought that a belief in federalism was something that unifies us. That's something that the state governments can decide in cooperation with the local governments, and the Congress of the United States does not need to be making decisions about restaurants in Charleston, South Carolina, or bars in El Paso, Texas, or what have you? Why don't we let the people of the states and the localities make those decisions? Reserve.